Hello, and welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace belonging in conversation with thought leaders and experts. Each episode, a guest and I dive into a question that highlights their area of expertise. And the goal is to leave you with tools and insights that you can use to make your workplace better and more human-friendly. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm an inclusion educator and advocate working for Dialectic, an inclusive workplace learning consultancy in lovely Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional lands of the Chinooktun and Haudenosaunee peoples. Joining me today is Captain Kamila Calko. Kamila is a trailblazer and advocate for gender equity in the marine industry. At 19, she landed a job as a tourboat captain despite having no prior marine or heavy machinery experience. And from there, she pursued a certification in navigation at a marine institute, then joined the Canadian Coast Guard, and over 5 years rose to second in command on a buoy-tending ice-breaking ship on the Great Lakes. With over 20 years experience and 30-plus vessels to her name, Kamila then moved to British Columbia, where she qualified via the Pacific Pilotage Authority Familiarization Program to sit the pilotage examination. She was the first and only woman in the nation to do so at the time. Her experiences in the marine industry have motivated her to found SeaLight, a consultancy dedicated to shifting the culture of the maritime industry, building inclusive structures, and guiding organizations to become more equitable, diverse, and thriving. Kamila has also founded a nonprofit called SeaLight Sisters, which supports women in the marine industry with access to community, mental health and well-being supports, education and empowerment programs, and legal advocacy. Captain Kamila, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Dominique. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm very excited and I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you here too, because I'm excited about the question that we're going to explore together, which, we're going to ground all of our conversation today in this question. If toughness built the ship, can belonging change its course? Which I think is, a great little question. Not only, is it sort of an analogy, but it's also very salient because of the rhetoric that we're seeing right now, particularly out of the US, I would say, that's, seems to be lifted straight from the manosphere. In the past months, we have major news outlets like the New York Times who've platformed folks who will say out loud that feminism and the presence of women in the workplace has ruined the workplace. So, today, for everyone who's sick of hearing that BS, we want to offer a palate cleanser. We want a story that points to the very tangible benefits of cultural change and renewal in traditionally male-dominated and hierarchical workplaces where grit is a job requirement. So our episode today is going to go out to all those ladies who are in the trades, in STEM, in construction, and in every physical and hazardous job. We see you, and you're important, and we want to talk about it. We want to talk about that change. So let's get right into it. What first drew you to the maritime world?
A fluke.
Oh, okay.
As we touched on, I landed a job when I was 19 as a tourboat captain in Toronto Harbor. Prior to that, just a little bit of my background is I had zero background in the marine industry. I think we said that.
Mm-hmm.
And no one in my family was seagoing. There were no seafarers. I was a Polish immigrant. My family and I immigrated when I was 5 to Toronto. Most of our time was on welfare. There was a lot of hardship. And I was at university, and there was a job fair saying students could be tourboat captains. And having never...
That's so random.
It was very random. My thoughts exactly. And at first I thought, oh, that couldn't be me. And I wasn't seeing a lot of opportunity for where my life was going because of my upbringing and our limitations. And I thought, well, why not me? So I remember turning around to the person at the kiosk and just saying like, okay, tell me more. And we had a good conversation. And so I applied. And out of, I think it was hundreds of applicants, I was one of 7 selected that year.
Oh, wow.
And I did not tell them that I'd never been on the water, not even in a canoe or kayak. And I didn't even have a driver's license. I'd never driven a car. And so the first thing I learned to drive was a tour boat in the Toronto Harbor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but I loved it. As soon as I figured it out, I loved the ship handling. There's a craft that goes with that. Also, the Toronto Harbor in the summer is absolute chaos. And I thrived in just calculating how to make it all work. We had a 1-hour tour. It turned out that I felt very alive in it. And so from that, I figured out, okay, like I want bigger boats. How do we do bigger boats? And so I ended up going, as we said, to a Marine Institute, and the rest of my story.
History. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, you must have nerves of steel because when I first learned how to drive a boat, it was at my family's cottage, which I no longer have, but nonetheless, it was in Georgian Bay, and I thought that was really busy, which it can be at times. But I cannot imagine, plopping you down into Toronto Harbor on a busy summer day, presumably with tourists and all of that action. That's a lot.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's a lot. And of course, that was just the beginning, and then things got more intense from there. So, for listeners who've never been on a ship for weeks at a time, can you give us a sense of what a typical rotation would look and feel like?
Hmm. Yeah, so the Toronto Harbor was cute, right? Day
Hmm.
job, like, yeah, it was a very sweet environment. But the reality is, the maritime world is definitely built on more like old, hard traits. There's a very rigid hierarchy because the job is inherently demanding. And of course, back in the day, you were out there on your own, fend for yourself. We needed these sort of rules. And there's this perceived necessity to be tough to do the job. So when you go out to sea, it's 24/7 immersion. Rotations can vary. So for me, most of my career was 28 days away, 28 days at home. But for other people, especially on the Great Lakes, that can be 90 days away and
Oh,
maybe I'm
wow.
at home.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a very different life experience. You don't just leave. You don't check out at the end of the day or your watch. So when stress is magnified, you can't just step away. The trust you have in the person beside you or next to you is the foundation of the entire operation.
Mm.
And the reality means that the cultural dynamic on board, whether good or bad, gets amplified because you're in it all the time. You eat with these people, they're your bunkmates, they sleep, next door to you. And when the culture is good, there's really nothing like it. There's this deep, profound camaraderie that you feel knowing you're all together at the mercy of the ship on this steel-hulled thing. Sometimes there's this very human experience of a shared submission to that humbling vastness, right?
Mm.
Where looking out for each other will transcend your rank and it becomes operational necessity. So it builds this really like intense bond and
Yeah.
trust
Yeah. Yeah.
that you may not experience elsewhere
Yeah.
because you
And I
don't
think
have to.
honestly, I think a lot of people go through their whole lives and never experience that. And it is something that like those intense types of jobs really do create. The closest I think I've come in my own personal life is like tree planting, which is not on the water, but does have a similar feeling of like you're in the wilderness, things can go wrong. It's very intense and difficult work, and you're staying in a camp with people, and the bonds that you create there are lifelong. But it certainly, that resonates for me, this idea that small cultural flavors really get amplified in a camp-like situation like that. And I can only imagine when you're on a vessel and gone for 28 days, it's a lot. That's intense.
Mhm.
And you've described the culture as valuing sort of those hard traits. What does that look like in practice, and how did that shape your early experiences in the industry?
Mhm. Right. So we said these hard traits, they're valued almost like a gold standard when it comes to leadership and competence.
Mm.
And how it can show up. So I might just jump around a little bit here is almost an imbalanced strength, like this idea that this is strength. And what that may lead to and how it shows up is that it can lead to masking or performing or not being able to show
Mm.
up authentically. To elaborate on these strengths, and again, these strains had a time and place back in the day, things like stoicism, independence, assertiveness.
Mm.
And today they still have a place in crises or when you really need to take that authority. But when they're unbalanced and they're the only thing that we value, they can perpetuate a culture of that strict hierarchy, of like a certain status quo. And depending on how that hierarchy with the leadership style is of the person at the top, it can perpetuate a huge culture of disrespect,
Mm.
yelling, belittling, which kind of become the norm.
Mm.
We touched on how did that shape my early experiences? Well, when I went off the tour boats, went to the Marine Institute, graduated. I was scooped up by the Canadian Coast Guard, and this was a while back. And I was put on something, as we said, the buoy tender. And the buoy tender is one of those vessels that really prides themselves on strength, grit, stoicism, because it is a very gritty job. You're hauling really big chains on deck. There's a big crane. There's, hundreds of pounds above your head in the buoy.
Mm.
And so I got thrown right into that. And what it ended up being was toxic modeling. So my captains, well, I won't say all of them, but there was a captain that had a style that was very micromanagerial, but also his idea of authority was yelling, humiliating, belittling people publicly. And so
Mm.
what that meant was the officers modeled that. That became the standard. Disrespect spread like wildfire. And for me, it may not being the person you're seeing today, but really redefining who I would be on that vessel. So shutting a lot of myself off, not being feminine, being very stoic. Yeah, really disassociating for when I'm out there.
Hmm.
And so I say, in short, the culture really demands compliance through
Yeah.
performance, ensuring that those hard, unbalanced traits were the only ones that thrived.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. And like the way that you're speaking about it now, I can just hear it's not a simple or pain-free experience, right? To conform or to lock down that part of yourself or to present another face in the midst of this very specific culture aboard a vessel. So let's talk about that cost of conformity, of trying to sort of fit into that environment where toughness and stoicism are prized. What did cost look like for you personally?
The biggest one for sure is the loss of self. And the secondary is sort of professional stagnation
Mm.
in a way. And I'll get into that in a second. So again, like it's a culture of performance and fear. Like you had to be a certain way or else you were, going against the grain. And that was a risk, especially when you're out at sea. So for me, that was a lot of burnout, self-doubt, exhaustion. And then when I came home, and this is kind of a common might be a common side effect from these toxic cultures is excessive drinking. Like we know in our industry, there's a lot of substance abuse and dependence because of
Mm.
this forcing of trying to be a certain way. So, like I said, I come home disassociated. And even though I had 28 days off, and that sounds lovely, the first week for sure was
Mm.
just to recover myself. Um, yeah. And as I mentioned, it required when I was on board, required me to be somebody else. So at the time, like my hair was completely short, pixie cut, loose clothing, no makeup, but also meant not being like friendly. I was supposed to be stoic. I was an officer, so command authority, boom your voice, because if you're delicate speaking, no one's going to respect or listen to you. And so it set the tone for like this was my model for career advancement. You had to be
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
certain way, or else there was no place for you here.
Yeah. And there's so many parallels to this in other industries too, right? Like I mentioned off the top, like I just feel like anybody who's in a traditionally male environment or a strongly hierarchical environment, or I'm thinking about women in the military, or gender diverse folks as well. Like it's not just women. There are lots of people who experience this in various ways. But that hearing you talk about that cost, it's hard. It's hard. Yeah, and it's very real. And what I'm excited to get to in this conversation is more questions about, can it be better? Is it possible for it to be better? And I can see from your radiant smile today that obviously it can, and that you can have a place in the industry without some of those costs. And that's such an uplifting idea. So I want to hear about that transformation. So at what point, I guess there had to be a spark. Like at what point did you realize that fitting in to that and the cost of that was not the same thing as belonging or showing up authentically, and that there was a problem here to solve?
It happened, I would say, percolated for a little bit. So there were
Mm.
a couple of stages in my career. One of them was still on that vessel that we just spoke about. And yeah, I feel like I felt it for years. I can't pin the mark. Let's call it 2 years. It was a while.
Mm.
That I knew there was this conflict inside where I knew I loved the work. I loved going to sea. I loved the potential of the teams and ship handling and just I loved what I was doing, and I did not love going to work because of all that extra heaviness, the emotional labor, the performance. And so for me, it came to a point where I had to either leave
Mm.
or start showing up like myself and give myself that freedom. And so I chose to take the risk of seeing what happened if I showed up as myself. But to say that, the 2 years or 3 years or whatever it took almost felt necessary because by then I had confidence, I had confidence in my skills, people knew me, I had a little more trust with the team. And so I could do that. And back then, I didn't have the language that what we were doing or what this culture was asking us to do was to fit in versus
Mm.
belonging. But when I started to show myself in this colorful way that you see me today, it rippled. People responded very well to it. It gave people
Mm.
permission to also be human. And that rippled throughout the crew and even the captains I was working with. And that's when I realized the power of showing up authentically.
Oh, that's
Is
amazing.
that,
So,
yeah.
yeah. So, like, can you tell us a little bit more concretely, like, when did you first start doing things differently and how did you feel that first wave of positive feedback? What's the story there?
I feel like it came in doses. It would be very little things.
Mm.
Um, like again, we go back to those hard traits where you have to be stoic and know it all, but then allowing self to be like, you know what? I know you've been on deck for 7 years. I've been on deck for 2 years trying to supervise you, share your knowledge, and also building that trust and like having those open conversations. They can be very small things. Like, tell me what you know. Like, we're here to do it together. And if you think it can be done better, let me know. I'm the person on deck. We can do it better. So
Yeah.
having people feel like they could be part of the work as opposed to being told like, or yeah, as opposed to being told like, oh, this is just what you have to do because I'm your supervisor, even though I obviously have not been around long enough.
Mm.
So that was sort of an element of like humility. Like, you know what? Let's just be people and let's honor what we know. And then I also remember that happening, I think I'll dive into a bit later, but even with the captains, when we had these rigid, like we're almost pigeonholed into what we're doing, this is all you're doing. But then I'm a very curious person. And so I would start conversations in a way that would make them feel like they were seen and supported.
Yeah.
Which, as a leader, you often feel like, oh, they don't need support. They're obviously commanding this presence that they're fine. But I would just like have their back. And I'd be like,
Mm.
I just noticed this. Or do you want me to do this right now? Like being proactive or just being like part of that. And that humanized their leadership. And so they were more open to sharing information and giving more opportunity. Yeah, approaching it in a way that wasn't an attack on like it's not an attack. I'm not like questioning
Yeah.
authority or whatnot. I'm really
Yeah. Yeah.
curious. I'm here to support you and just making it more human. I don't know if that
Yeah, for sure. And like, so at a certain point you started captaining.
yeah.
And so how did that, like, you had already started kind of with this spark of authenticity or trying to do things a different way, and then you were captaining others all of a sudden, right? Can you tell us about how that started and how your approach to that task was different because of who you are?
Yes. So the story I just spoke about right before this was when I was still a junior officer. So moving
Okay.
ranks. So third
Yeah.
officer, second in command, chief officer, captain. Those stories I was speaking about was when I was still a junior officer. So trying to find agency and trying to show myself authentically when told by my rank that I don't have a lot of authority or power.
Mm.
Um, and then by the time I was captain, so I was captain, I was thrown into a captain's position with the Coast Guard as well in a different region. I transferred out west, as we talked about. And the very last minute, I had the proper certification to become a captain. They called and they said, do you want to be captain of this vessel? I'd only been on this vessel for 2 trips previous. So, as we know, those were 4-week trips as second in command. They told me that the crew didn't have a lot of continuity of experience. So, what to say is
Mm.
we didn't have a lot of familiarization with the vessel. So normally when you join a ship or if you're going from chief officer to captain, you want to be with a crew that's been on that boat for a while because if you don't know something, you can lean in on the experience. However, in our case, out of a crew of 9, we had only 3 people on that boat that had been on there more than 3 trips.
Oh, wow.
And to paint it for our audience, it meant the whole bridge team. So everybody in charge of the bridge was pretty much new, including myself. Everybody in the engine room, there were two people, half of them were new, but the most senior person was brand new to that vessel. And then we have something called a deck crew. So three people on board that do like the more manual day-to-day operations.
Hmm.
And out of three, we only had one that had been on that vessel. The other two, one just came from forestry firefighting.
Oh,
And
wow. Yeah.
so we had a very,
Totally different. Yeah.
yeah, we did not have a lot of experience, A, in the industry, B, on that vessel, and C, together. So there were a lot, like this became a very high risk operation very quickly. And so I said yes to this. It took me a week to decide. I was like, ooh, this is a great opportunity. It's my first command. It's a big deal. And also, this might, set my career on fire because it can go horribly wrong.
Hmm.
So I did say yes. And so on the very first day, what I did was I gathered everybody in the mess or like the common area of the ship. And instead of pretending that I knew it all and I was going to boss everybody around, I just laid it out there. I said, like, hey, like, I've been on this vessel for a little bit. I do know a lot. There's a lot I don't know. We have people on here that hold a lot more experience. We also have people on here that have never been here. And I don't want you to move into this patrol. We call them patrols, shifts at sea. Feeling like you have to prove proficiency or they have to prove that you know it. I said, our situation is frankly quite unfair.
Hmm.
The operation is demanding. We're not here to make magic. We're here to do our best. That was what I imparted on the crew. And I needed them to know that, and I said it very clearly, if something goes sideways, it's on me. Like, we're
Hmm.
going to do our best. We're going to lean into each other. We all have strengths from our walks of life, even though they may not be marine specific. Lean in, ask for help, support each other if someone's struggling, and then if something goes wrong, I got you, was
Hmm.
essentially the message.
Yeah. How unusual is that? Like, is this like a very, something you'd never heard anybody else do in your career?
I haven't. And at
Hmm.
that point, definitely not. Something I can touch on. Our industry right now is in a bit of a labor shortage crisis where there is a lot of turnover and how every captain handles that situation. I can't speak to it. Again, our
Hmm.
industry is very isolated. At that point, I had been in it quite a while, I think 15 years, and that was unusual at the time.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
So how did your crew respond then? Some of them who were brand new wouldn't have known that it was new or different, but in general, I'm sure that people sensed a difference in that approach. How did they respond when you were leading from this place of, I want to say almost vulnerability, right? Like you kind of were being honest and transparent, and there's a lot packed into that first statement that you made, right? This idea of teamwork, the idea of responsibility as a leader, the idea of not trying to perform when you don't know, like don't pretend, let's figure it out. All of these ideas are, it's much more than obviously your gender. It's also a whole leadership approach. I'm so curious, how did it go? How did people respond?
Beautifully.
Oh, amazing.
Be the best word. I think it was the freedom. Like you said, like some people didn't know and others were like, what's going on here? But
Hmm.
that opportunity that sounded like a nightmare was actually an opportunity. It was like, well, let's see what we can do with this very unique dynamic. And I myself can't fake something that I'm not. So they responded with loyalty, innovation, courage, and incredible collaboration. I didn't appreciate the time when I brought them all together that day, that humility humanized leadership for them.
Mm.
It sort of dispelled that fear of failure. It set the stage for what I now know as psychological safety. At the time, I didn't have that language, and that's that felt permission for candor, that understanding that, you can ask questions, you can speak up, you can try things, you can make a mistake, you can admit that mistake, and you're not going to be judged or penalized for it. This is
Mm.
all an opportunity for growth. And I do have a distinct example. So I remember I don't know how many weeks we're out at this time, and we're going to anchor. And so the vessel I was on did something called conservation and protection. So we had fishery officers on board. We had a boat, a rigid hull boat that we would launch regularly, multiple times a day. They would go patrol areas for fishing violations. And so we were going to anchor, and I had a very, I guess, skinny crew at the time. Um, and I sent out the anchored party. So there are people going up to the front of the boat. They're going to drop the hook, the anchor. to anchor because that's what we needed to do. And the boat was away, and the only experienced deckhand was away with the other officers. And I just remember we're slowing down to anchor, and the second officer comes on the radio and they say, Captain, we've actually never anchored before.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, right. I did not in all, like, it's an intense program. I'm like, I did not remember that. So in that moment, I had a few options. I was like, do I wait for that one deckhand for him to help us anchor this vessel,
Mm.
even though I knew he was already being leaned into quite a bit and was feeling the strain of being the only experienced person? Or do I create opportunity? And so we had a bit of a conversation. I was like, okay, have you seen it? Have you been on deck? Like, can you tell me what the procedure is? I can see them on the front of the boat and they're talking to each other. And they're like, yeah, we're feeling pretty good. And I'm like, okay. And so I said, just go for it. Let's do it. So drop in our world is like 4 shots on deck. So it's a certain length. And so you can hear the rumbling of the anchor going out and the chain,
Mm.
and then it stops. And then they come on the radio and they're like, Captain, I'm just like, yep. And they're like, we dropped 5 shots on deck. And I'm like, great. We're safely anchored, right? Like 5, 4, not a big deal. What happened in that moment was they built confidence with themselves, their teammate, myself. They explored their potential. Like they'd never done
Hmm.
it. Normally they would just wait. And instead they're like, ooh, let's step into this. And so like a lot of growth happened. And you could see it, right? It really ignites people when they have these opportunities. So yeah, there's a lot that happened in what seemed like a very simple moment.
That's amazing. And I'm also reading a benefit here is also safety. Like the psychological safety actually led to real safety because they admitted that they'd never done it before, which allowed you to then ensure that they were well supported to do this in a way that was physically safe for everybody else.
Yeah,
Right?
they had the option. You're right, because in a traditional setting, there's the whole fake it as you know it, right? The captain gives
Right.
you the order, we do the order, you figure it out, we hope it goes well. In this case, they were like, we haven't done it, but I could
Hmm.
tell they were like, I think we can probably do it. And I'm like, okay, well, let's explore that. Yeah. So just being able to have that conversation.
Oh, that's so amazing. I think that this is such a great example, and it's really neat to hear that you had such a successful first experience with this crew. Did they respond? You said that they responded to you with loyalty. How did you feel that?
I feel like they paid more attention to maybe when I wasn't at my best. Again, as a captain, like especially as a new captain, you don't sleep.
Mm.
Let's face it, you're up like scheming and planning and making sure when you're anchored that the wind's not too strong and you're not dragging and or when you're steaming or sailing. It was just little things like maybe I needed a coffee and they make my coffee, or they could catch me very openly in a mistake, or they would do something that normally I would have to like ask, but they just knew that that was important. It had to be done. I think to sum it up, they had my back.
Yeah.
And it didn't
Yeah.
have to be huge. It was the little day-to-day things where you're like, oh, thank you. Because I could really use support. We all want support.
Yeah.
It's a big load, and having people that have your back.
So you must have walked off that vessel feeling pretty good.
It took a minute to process, but yes. Yeah, there was a lot of unexpected things. We had a lot of other major things that happened during that 28 days that really allowed our team to build. We had a major search and rescue call that at the time was the largest multi-asset call on the West Coast in 10 years. Everybody really pulled together. And again, when there was trauma from that, they felt safe enough to come up and be like, hey, not able to perform my duties. I'm really upset about what happened. No
Hmm.
problem. We really did the human element. The final beautiful moment of that trip was towards the end of the trip or patrol. They brought me into the common area of the ship and they presented me with a card. And it wasn't any card. They had to make it. They bought construction paper. We had glue sticks. Like they cut out things and everybody of the team signed it with these wonderful things. And in my career, I'd never seen that. And it really solidified that, at the beginning I said, oh, we're not here to make magic, but we actually made magic. And that magic was the psychological safety and
Hmm.
having everybody come together. And yeah, so when I walked that vessel, I did feel amazing. But part of that was because you planted that seed in everybody else. And years down the road, because this happened a while back now, I still, will cross paths with someone and they'll still talk about it or they'll talk about it to somebody else because we all know now what it looks like to feel like you belong on a ship and you can show up and you can try things and be supported.
Yeah.
Um, and that has a very unexpected rippling effect.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, just hearing this story and hearing that positive impact, I guess my next question is why are people in the marine industry and in other industries for that matter? I think this is like broadly applicable, but why are people resistant to this kind of change? Why can't they see the benefit as clearly as you do? And why is there kind of a blockage there to having this be the culture writ large?
Hmm. I think there's a lot of elements at play. I can probably distill it into three for the sake of our conversation. One, again, is the industry is very old. And when you're in shipboard, like when you're out at sea, it's very isolated. So it's really hard to change a culture that's so separate from other influences.
Hmm.
And again, because most of the cultural modeling happens at sea, a lot of people learn their style from the person before them. And so this leads into what's called a scarcity mindset. So
Yeah.
this idea held by those who survived, like that old tough system that I had to suffer to succeed, so you should too. Somehow that if the culture was made easier or different, it devalues their hard-won struggle to get to where they are.
Hmm.
I've heard that quite a bit through my career, even from people my age being like, well, I had it this way, so you have to have it too. And I'm like, you have a choice. We have a choice.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. And then the second one is this fear, especially if we're talking about authority, is this fear of losing power among leaders. Like, right now, when somebody says vulnerability, we think, what do we think? Weakness,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So they worry that admitting uncertainty will erode their authority, when in reality, it's building trust, and trust is the foundation for everything. Um, yeah. Well, it doesn't have to just be a C everywhere, right? If you want.
Hmm.
Great.
They need
Yeah.
to like read a Brene Brown book or something. Sounds
Oh,
like.
she's definitely my inspiration.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Hmm.
that's awesome. And what about, I mean, what about women? Are
Hmm.
they also resisting change or do they uphold these cultures that don't serve them? Obviously, you're not the only woman in the marine industry, so I'm just wondering in general how that's going.
Yeah, I can speak to my experience and what I continue to hear through my platforms, especially SeaLight Sisters, that we are not immune to this scarcity mindset. Women who survive that historically toxic environment often adopt an even more amplified scarcity mindset, believing
Mm,
again that there's only room for one or two of us at the top. And it has to be a certain type of us at the top. We have a very like narrow definition of what it is to be a woman leader in the marine industry right now. And this makes them almost like a gatekeeper. They actively uphold these standards and they police the authenticity and femininity of those coming up behind them, especially women. There's a way that this can manifest. I'll just throw some lingo at you, but and again, I'm learning, there's a lot of self-education I had to do through my career to give this a voice and be like, oh, that's what that was. For five
mhm.
years, this is what it was. So something called lateral violence, which is essentially a manifestation of redirected aggression. So since women that have made it to the top, and again, this is broadly speaking, I know there's exceptional leaders out there that we're all redefining what leadership is. But when we're talking about the ones that had made it and pioneered before us in the old culture, sometimes when they can't challenge the system that caused their own trauma, they turn that hostility inward and can target it towards other women who, in their eyes, lack power. So when you're new, if you look a little different, if you're feminine, all of a sudden you don't have the power dynamic that we think is necessary to survive in this industry. And that can show up again like public humiliation, being really hard on women, withholding info, even subtle sabotage, all because they view that this different way of being is threatening the legitimacy of the way they had to fight to get to where they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's so deeply internalized, right? And then,
so deeply.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's why the work of what we're doing with Sea Light Sisters especially is so vital because again, our industry is so we work remotely, we're isolated. It does a great job at isolating us and that we don't necessarily talk to each other. So it's the idea of shifting this competition to a collective empowerment where there is
Hmm.
room for all of us in different ways. And we don't have to follow this format, even though we will get some resistance. But I think
Yeah.
we're in a great.
Do you want to tell us a little bit? I want to ask you about Sea Light in general, but maybe you can start with Sea Light Sisters. What is it that you're doing in that space?
SeaLight Sisters started very simply. So I started it as an online app to connect women in our industry. Most of it is virtual, like discussion forums, socials, or whatnot, to validate everyone's experience. The idea was to remove the idea of all those hardships and those extra burdens that you're carrying, to remove it from being an internalized thing to a systems thing. So,
Mm,
again, being in the industry for me was really challenging, but I was determined. And so determined, I put my head down, blinders on, and just did what I had to do to get to the top without really paying attention to what was happening to other women in our industry because honestly, I didn't have the energy. It took everything. And
mm,
so when I got there, finally, I had the space to look around and be like, oh, what are the experiences of other women in our industry? And when I started talking and actively interviewing, I started hearing very common stories and not just stories. It got to the point I heard a common voice, a narrative where someone was saying, like, oh, I'm not going to do this because I have to do this first. And that was exactly what I told myself. Meanwhile, I know their male counterparts don't have that conversation with themselves. And that was when I decided, okay, we have to connect and we have to talk about it because we're holding ourselves back because of a system and a message that we're getting. And so from that, when I started SeaLight Sisters, women came together, more things started to come out that were clearly not addressed. So there's a lot more resources our industry is really lacking when it comes to supporting talented women. Yeah, like our mental health needs are different, our port needs are different, our shipboard realities are different. Like ships are very built with men in mind. There's
yeah.
there's
Yep.
a lot of extra things. And so what we do with SeaLight Sisters is how do we navigate that? How do we feel empowered? It could be anything from how do we do assertive communication? Because there's a lot of times we want to speak up, but A, we don't have the language. So part of it is equipping with language. You're like, oh, that was a bias. That was a microaggression. This is what it was, educating people around you. And then it can escalate to things like if someone has been shouldering discrimination and harassment for a really long time and they're at the point where they're like, I gotta leave, I don't know what else to do. It's like,
Mm.
let's look at your legal avenues. Like maybe we can do some more processes within your employer and support you staying because yeah,
Yeah.
retention is a huge challenge. And so we're just
Yeah.
trying to figure out. And then the other element is like maybe you've had a great time, but we can still offer mentorship, being like, well, here's the big picture of how to get to where you need to go. And we can just offer the mentorship element of the technicalities of Transport Canada. So
That's amazing. I wish there was like a Sea Light Sisters for every industry because truly, like this is groundbreaking stuff. You have really just by having a space for people's voice
mhm.
to kind of come together and coalesce. I think that's so powerful and obviously what was needed in this particular industry at this time. Congratulations on your work there and thank you for your commitment to that. It's really honestly heartwarming to hear. And I'm excited to see kind of where Sea Light Sisters goes and whether this model can be applied in other workplaces as well, because you're one person and you've made this happen, right? Obviously with collaboration and with the input of others, but I think it's a really amazing success story. And I want to talk to you about Sea Light in general. So there's, the Sea Light Sisters part, and then there's Sea Light, which you're obviously using as a broader business, and it's not just women centered. So tell me a little bit more about that and how you're using Sea Light to start those conversations in a workplace that's not used to talking about, culture, belonging, or inclusion.
Yes, you're right. So SeaLight is the broader, I like to say, organizational element. Our idea, what we do is we do the main thing is sort of like keynote talks and workshops to, like you talked about, bring in those conversations about what does a cultural transformation look like? Why is it important that we start thinking about it being more inclusive and not just inclusive for underrepresented groups, but inclusive for everybody? Because again, the culture can be very slow to evolve and it holds on to some values and traits that, you know what, frankly, most people don't identify with. When they step off that boat, I can promise you a lot of people are not the same person when they go ashore to their friends that they are amongst their colleagues and crewmates. So the idea
Mm.
is let's stop being on that one end of that spectrum, which is heavily masculinized, and just go somewhere in the middle. Again, that authenticity, vulnerability, where we can just show up as self. So and talking about why is that beneficial and how can we do that. So the tier one of, I call it tier one because SeaLight and SeaLight Sisters are both baby businesses. Like we're pretty young. SeaLight is 2 years in January. And tier one is raising awareness For a long time, we feel it, we can see, we see we have retention problems. We see we have absenteeism, turnover, people are quitting, but we're not really grasping then more nuanced about what is it. And so empowering with the language about the various extra unseen biases and burdens that everybody is holding that takes so much more mental energy to do their job, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
If we lived in a world where we all showed up as we could just focus on our work. But when you show up on a ship, because of all that extra culture, decoding, following rules, there's so much energy and then energy into performing that it leads to exhaustion. So our core approach is to talk about accountability and
Hmm.
accountability for everybody, like leaders, but also everybody on board. And that's sort of what the Goddard story embodied. And that if we address accountability and respect, where cultures were actually respectful, that would address the operational issues
Mm.
where the ships wouldn't be coming back. Like there's ships being tied up at the docks because they can't crew them because people don't want to go to sea, right? So we got to make it a place where it's safe,
Right.
respectful, and people will love going there. So they already know, by the time SeaLight came to be, we already knew we were having these problems. Talent retention was a big thing, operational cost is a big thing. I don't have to tell them, they know it.
Mm.
And so the biggest thing with SeaLight right now is that vocabulary. It's
Right.
just actually being able to name and then equipping everybody with the language and the tools, almost like a toolkit when they go back to sea, that they can call out dynamics, break out certain dynamics, know how to feel permission in a way to support people openly and that it's okay. It's not a taboo to show feelings, like really breaking it down to why it's amazing for everyone.
Yeah. 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 No, I think it's really powerful. Just the idea that that first step is the language.
Mhm.
If you can't name it, it's hard to fix it. That holds true in every workplace. You need to have a clear idea of what it is that's going on so that you can unpack it, so that you can kind of move things forward and address those problems. Obviously, in the marine industry, there are major regulators. You have Transport Canada and the International Maritime Organization, and I'm guessing those are giants that move slowly. So those little bits of work that are done on an interpersonal level, and like the story that you told about your own captaining, is that the path that you're seeing for change across the whole industry, given, you know, you have to sort of outpace regulators in a way, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. So even though we know the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, we're having these conversations now about, yes, we have to train seafarers for understanding gender dynamics and psychological safety. However, it's going to take years before it
Yeah.
becomes implemented in Transport Canada.
Yeah.
And our industry cannot wait or afford to keep waiting. This conversation about inclusion and trying to make ships, um, hospitable is a bit dramatic, but welcoming
Sure.
for those that don't fit the norm has been
Hmm.
a conversation since I started 20 years ago. And we know the numbers haven't moved, right? Women still, I think we're 1.2% globally seafarers, which I think dropped from 2%, but maybe they weren't able to capture the data the same way 20 years ago. Anyway, so yes, so the vision with Sea Light is, we appreciate the top-down mandates from regulators or the organizations or whatnot. But because there's this huge isolated element to seafaring, the biggest impact you're going to have is with the people that you're with.
Hmm.
And so throughout my career, I've been testing different ways to do that. And as we talked about, first it was conformity, and then it was trying to break out of that. And what I have learned is that everyone has a real lever for change. I
Mm.
like these days, I believe everybody's an architect of change and that we all have individual agency. And the hierarchy sometimes makes us believe that we don't, right? So there's this beautiful quote by Alice Walker. The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any.
Hmm.
Sometimes when you walk into a hierarchical structure and you start at the beginning or you're at the bottom rung, so to speak, you feel like you just do what you're told, right? But the reality is that we all are, like I said, architects of change. We all have a sphere of influence, and that's the way we use our words, the way we interact with everybody, and the way we take responsibility for everything. So
Hmm.
maybe you're working in an environment that's not amazing, but you probably have a team, two, three, four people, and in that micro climate, you can make an environment that will work for you and it will make you want to show up for work. And again, what that does is it ignites people to remember what it's like to show up fully at work. And then if your team disperses, well, that seed has been planted and now you can take it somewhere else. And
Mm.
what we often underestimate, and I think is shut down quite a bit, is like the power of these influential relationships. Is
Yeah.
that,
Yeah, absolutely. The rippling out.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you will never know what the effect will be, but you
Hmm.
just have to trust that
Hmm.
it starts with you.
That's amazing. Well, I mean, there's no better place than that to leave this conversation. So I want to just thank you so much for being here. Captain Kamila Calko, thank you for your work in the area and for being with me today and for taking the time to share also from your story. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. This has been a delight, and yeah,
Yeah.
I'm all talked out. I don't know what to say.
Good.
I
I've
wish
done
we
my
could keep
job.
going. I have more.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. And
Yeah.
if our listeners are curious to hear more, I'm going to encourage them all to go and find you because I know that you do have so much more to say. So if you're curious about Camila's work, please go to LinkedIn and check her out there. And you can also go to SeaLight.one and SeaLightSisters.org. And I'll drop those links in the show notes for you to make it easy to click through. But go check out her work. It's really amazing. Also, please reach out to me if you'd like to be featured as a guest on this podcast or if you'd like to nominate someone. I really love having conversations like this or with L&D, HR, DEI professionals who are really passionate about their message or in folks in adjacent fields who have something to teach us in, these people and culture learning roles. And if you like what you're hearing, leave us a rating and a review or share this episode to your own socials. It really does help get this podcast into more ears. I'm Dominique. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time on Just One Q.